Welcome, everyone. I am Alina Steele. I am the president of the San Diego Flute Guild, and this is our first live event of the year. Today is a warm-up class presented by Marley Eder, who was a young artist winner a couple of years back with the San Diego Flute Guild. He's a fantastic player. He's getting his DMA at USC, and he's also a student teacher there.
Thank you so much, Alina. The only other thing I need to share is I'm the same as all of you. I'm a guy that plays the flute in the time of COVID, and I feel like we're all navigating that right now, and hopefully we can talk about some of the priorities that we all have and how we go about it. And just kind of contextualize our playing right now. But more importantly, this is about warm-ups and stuff. So let's chat a bit about that. Just for myself, not to get too semantic about it, but I feel like it's good just to think of what warm-ups are versus what technical exercises are. Because I feel like it takes maybe 3 to 5 minutes to actually get warmed up. And what I mean by that is if you pick up your flute and you're noodling around, you're playing just different melodies, things that you're working on, beginnings, it doesn't take long to get into our sounds and to become acclimated to the way that the flute feels that particular day and get started. And I feel like, especially when I was younger, there's a lot of emphasis on developing our technique, and that's something that is super duper important. I'm not saying that we should only warm up for 5 minutes a day or anything like that, because that would be quite the hot take to be coming out with. But I think that it's good to differentiate between the two, because it's easy to get kind of lost in that. And when I pick up my flute to play first thing, in the day, I make it a priority just to play things that I think get me making the sound that I want right off the bat. And for me, there's a couple of things that are very subjective, personal kind of pieces that I like, that I just feel like I have a really clear idea of the way I want them to sound. And for whatever reason, I have a very easy time just picking up my flute and playing them the way that I want to play. And it's a way of just very, very quickly just picking up the instrument and making the sounds I want to play. So for me right now, for instance, I really love just the first phrase of Reineke's First Flute Concerto. I just think it's just stellar. It's a really beautiful, just kind of D major lick. And for whatever reason, when I pick up my flute and I play that, it really helps me just kind of orient myself into, okay, this is the kind of sound I like to play with as a flutist, and this is the way that I kind of want to move around the flute and shape a phrase and play with this particular dynamic and things like that. And so with myself and with all my students, I highly encourage them to build a binder of pieces that are like their favorite melodies, and it can be anything from Poulenc's second movement to the theme of your favorite movie, or something you heard on the radio, or anything of that nature. But basically, a list of things that are moving, that are compelling to you, and that you want to play, importantly, and something that you have like this physical collection of things where if you're picking up your flute and you want to just get right off the bat, you just open it to a random page and you're like, oh yeah, that piece is wicked cool, I want to play that right now. You get going. And it's a great way to just kind of get started. And I think it's an important way of having the right priorities when we pick up the flute. Because when I pick up my flute and I tell myself, oh yeah, I need to practice, intonation with a drone and dynamics from mezzo piano to softer and all these things, it's not really the most motivating thing in the world for me. And especially now, in a period where, I don't know about all of you, but without constant live performances, which is what I was accustomed to before COVID, I don't have a lot of things that I'm actively working towards in terms of performances. So I mean, the necessity to practice and the motivation to practice is less consistent now than it normally is, and that is totally fine. Everyone, if anyone can identify with that, I feel like you should be very forgiving and patient with yourself. And what I'm talking about right now can definitely go a long way in helping to get sort of remotivated and reoriented on the things that we like playing about, the things that we love about music and playing. So I think just first and foremost, a warm-up for me is playing things that you want to play that are music, not an exercise, but are actual music that you feel get you going, flutistically, musically, and just in terms of your inspiration. to go along with that, one of the things that I've been doing as a student in my graduate work is I've been studying traverso in the early music department at USC, and I was really struck. I study with a recorder player. And we were chatting about warm-ups once, and the whole concept was kind of mind-boggling to her because her concept of warm-ups and a lot of people's concepts of warm-ups for early music is you pick up a particular piece and you see what key it's in and you play your tonic, some dominant chords on the instrument. You make sure some of your intervals are responding the way you expect them to, they're in tune, and if it is, then you're cooked, you're good to go. You can kind of launch into your piece. There isn't the same sort of degree of scrutiny and development that they strive for in terms of like the minutia of their sound in favor of getting those things from actually playing music. It's a completely different mindset. And I've also encountered flutists that feel that way similarly. I remember talking once to the flutist Mathieu Dufour about warm-ups, he's now in Berlin Philharmonic, and he doesn't do any warm-ups and never really has. He just does vocalies, which is something that we're going to cover today. He only does warm-ups in the context of playing beautiful phrases that exercise your sense of shape and contour and dynamic control, and it's all this stuff that's kind of synthesized into this one thing. So I don't know if it's just my own upbringing or an American thing or a modern flute thing or what, but I feel like a lot of people have this conception of warm-ups as you have to do several hours of scales and long tones, and if you don't do it, then you're not, checking off all the boxes and achieving in the aspects that you're expected to. And that is a complete misconception. It's a false narrative that we do not need to buy into. If you do, then by all means, there's a lot of merit to developing your skills in that way, but I don't necessarily feel like it's the end all. That's all I'm saying about that. So, as far as it pertains to the warm-up, I don't feel like warming up is something that should take a lot of time, and it doesn't necessarily need to if you go about it by approaching it in a way of what are my favorite pieces, let's just play it right off the bat, get the flute moving, and get the flute working the way that we want. Having said that, I do around 45 minutes of technical exercises on an almost daily basis, and I feel like those are necessary for me because there's always more that we can do to develop and hone our skills as flutists, and all of that will contribute to our ability to express ourselves in our music and to render the pieces that we're working on the way that we want them to be. So there's a couple of general things about this sort of technical exercises that I think are important. So there's some that I do every day without change, and those are kind of my foundation, and there's something that are very reassuring to me. And I think it's important to have some aspect of a routine with them because if I'm ever traveling for concerts or performance competitions rather, it's very grounding to me to be able, whether I'm in a hotel room or in some, room backstage getting ready for a concert, it's very grounding to me to have something where I can say, okay, these are my go-to things that I do every day, and no matter how I'm feeling, what the flute sounds like in my warm-up, what the expectations of myself are in the moment before a performance, this is something that I've done 1,000+ times, and it's something that's reassuring and can really pull me into a place where I feel comfortable and centered. And I'm going to be sharing some of those with you today. And then there's another section that isn't something that I do on a regular basis as a routine. And these things change on a weekly basis, and they're completely grounded in the music that I'm working on. So for instance, right now, I'm working on Mr. Baryakov's transcription of the Sibelius Violin Concerto. And there's a number of patterns that I found very difficult technically in that. And so I took them and transcribed them into every single key and turned them into a warm-up. So it won't be remotely difficult once I get that under my fingers and I'm comfortable with that in all the keys. And so, I'm constantly responding to, oh, this is something that's super tricky in this piece. I'm going to do it in every single key until, that thing that I feel is the weakest aspect of my performance in this thing is actually something that I'm now super comfortable with and can tap into as something that is a source of, that routine, something that can ground me in an aspect of my playing that I feel very comfortable with. So, we talked about getting a centered tone. We've talked about intonation. there's one other really big one that I feel isn't necessarily emphasized in Mr. Moise's book, at least not in the first couple of exercises, although there's a great exercise for it later, and it's articulation. I feel like articulation, especially as I've gotten older, has become a bit of a white whale for me, a bit of an obsession. And that's mostly because when I was a younger flutist, I was so interested in my tone. You know, I wanted the most big, golden, vibrant, colorful, versatile sound possible. And I invested almost all of my mental energy into developing what I thought was that ideal tone. And it was only much later that I realized that I wasn't paying a lot of careful attention to the way I was shaping my notes, the initiation of the tone, the release of the tone. And so for the last several years, I've made it a priority of mine to really delve into how I can play in a much more enunciated, articulated way. That was a bit more crafted in terms of the notes I was playing. And there's a couple of exercises I do for that. Although, you know, like I said, you can pick anything that you want. But I think the important thing when focusing articulation is this idea of breath kicks. At least that's what I call them. I don't know if any of you are familiar with those, but I was first introduced to those by my teacher in my undergrad through a book by Miss Cohen about studying with Jean-Pierre Rampal. And he had an exercise where he'd have his students with a short sort of blast of air initiated from the diaphragm, just producing a clear tone right off the bat, just a short crystalline tone. And the point of that exercise is a lot of the times I feel like we over rely on our tongues to initiate the sound of the flute, and it creates a heavy articulation, kind of something that's very harsh and not flexible, you know. And that's, you know, it's okay. We've all been there. I still am a lot of the time. But if we're able to create a tone that's immediately vibrant, centered, and crystalline just with our air, then our tongue, whether it's on a t or k syllable, can just lightly craft the beginning of that note in a ton of different ways. And we don't need to be over reliant on that to initiate our sounds. So, for instance, just on an F major scale, which is what I like to do, the exercise, I'm not going to use any tongue whatsoever. I'm just going to be using a short blast of air from deep in my body. Just something like that. Seems relatively easy, but there's quite a few pitfalls you can fall into with this. Some people get into something where it sounds almost like a bwah, 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 almost like, you know, where the sound doesn't immediately come out, or it's too long and it takes too long for the sound to really fully center itself and initiate. I feel like this is great because it shows us where our embouchure should be optimally to get the sound that we want, and it shows us how much air we use because I'm you can't tell in this, but I'm 6'3" and I have a ton of air, and I have a tendency to use too much air when I play the flute. I feel like I constantly have to use less air actually in order to get the most resonant tone possible. So for me, this really helps me balance, you know, what position my embouchure should be in to get the most full resonant immediate tone possible, and how much air I actually need to make that sound without it being too much or too little. So once more without tongue, it sounds like this. You know, simple, easy. And then once that starts, then just adding the t syllable and then going through it again on a k syllable, just so that the tongue can lightly craft the beginning of the note, but that same initiation coming from deep in the diaphragm and that position here is in alignment. And in that way, I feel like the articulation, the sound, is then independent from the articulation. And in playing in that way, I find it to be much more liberated than what I described before, where the tongue is initiating the note and there's an over-reliance on that in order to produce tones, because then everything becomes kind of uniform. So for me, I think it's really important to do that. So we talked about centered tone, intonation, articulation. There's other things that we can work on as well, but I feel like they can be worked on in context, and I would love, Alina, if now's a good time for you to bring up some of those warm-ups. Why don't we start with the intervals one that I sent you? So I scanned a couple of different exercises, and I organized them into two categories: intervals and vocalies. Um, for those of you who aren't aware of what vocalies are, vocalies, it's just a word that means just a musical phrase. A lot of you, if you've ever been at music school and you've been in a practice room next to a singer, you have heard them doing a gazillion vocalies, just going up and down different arpeggios, usually with a pianist who's coaching them in all of the keys. And for whatever reason, I never felt like that was emphasized in my own sort of musical development until much later. And I feel like it's a wonderful way to get oriented to the flute because, like I said, a lot of these exercises isolate different aspects of our playing. But what's so great about Vocalies is they'll incorporate and synthesize a bunch of different things together. And in that way, we can get a lot more done. And they're more musically beautiful, in my opinion. And there's something a bit more compelling in terms of color and everything like that. Having said that, though, let's start with some intervals. So I feel like one of the most important things as flutists is to just be as flexible as possible. And intervals are the best way to do it. And I absolutely love this exercise. If any of you are interested in these, by the way, they're all from a book by the exceptional French flutist Philippe Bernold. He has a couple of books. This one's called The Technique of Embouchure. And there's just a gazillion different warm-ups, which is nice because, they all have similar themes, but you don't have to do the same ones every day, so it keeps it fresh. But I would love to just play through this first one together. And I think the best way to do that, or the way that I've done this in previous streams, is if you all are interested in playing, please mute yourself, because if we try to play at the same time, there will be this weird delay and it won't be uniform. So if you're interested in playing along, just mute yourself and I'll keep myself unmuted. And I'd love to just play through this. And what I'm going to be focusing on is just trying to be as neutral and open as possible with my embouchure and making sure that my sound is centered all the way to the end of the half notes. So making sure that I'm open and singing in the first interval, the first octave. And then on that last note, just keeping the same color and tone all the way through the end of the note. Like he says, pay attention to finish the note cleanly, avoiding air noise. So making sure that that focus and color is maintained all the way through the end of the phrase. So without further ado, let's launch into this first exercise here. So 1, 2, ready? So when I do that, one of the things that I love about it is simply that, first and foremost, as flutists, I feel like sometimes when we get these ascending intervals, like ascending octaves, we have a tendency, especially beginner flutists, like people who are in their first few months of playing, they achieve higher notes by either using too much air and just pushing the sound with their air, or by tightening their embouchures or creating tension in order to achieve a second octave. And that's something that, even though, you know, as beginning flutists, it's a crutch that some people rely on. One of the things that we do, of course, as more advanced flutists, is we find the most efficient economic ways of doing things. And this exercise, going from piano to forte, there's a sense of a natural expansion that occurs, an openness through the intervals. And I feel like in ascending intervals, whether it's in a comfortable register like the first and second octave, or doing this exercise an octave up, which also has a lot of merit, it creates this sense immediately of when there's a big, you know, kind of scary interval. You know, I just imagine myself almost like I'm sunbathing or luxuriating in it and just expanding and opening through those kinds of intervals, as opposed to the opposite, which there's always a danger of. So this exercise, oh, well, I hear something. So yeah, this really does a great job of addressing that. And then in addition to that, allowing those long notes to sort of taper naturally in that color. This exercise, it's dynamics, it's an interval expansion exercise, it's a color exercise. It brings a lot into it. Alina, why don't we go to the next one on this page? So for those of you who are familiar with movies, this very much resembles the one on the first page of his De La Sonorite warm-up book. And the thing that I love about this exercise in particular is, I mean, coming out swinging forte, you're allowing yourself to feel a sense of connection through multiple notes. And I feel like the second exercise is a wonderful way of continuing color through different notes and making just a connected phrase through half steps, which is the easiest interval. So for me, whenever I practice this exercise, I just try to go for consistency of color and a smooth, effortless connection from note to note. No barrier, no wall. Just like each note are just beads on a string, the string being just a smooth, continuous note of a similar color. So let's all play exercise number 2 together with that in mind. So 1, 2, ready? So I feel like that's important, you know, because at times, and I feel like we can all admit freely to this, we as flutists, you know, as musicians, it's easy to just focus on notes sort of independently, you know, note, 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 note. But whenever I play music, I always try to have the largest sort of perspective of a phrase or a structure of a piece or something like that. And whenever I play, I always try to emphasize that as much as possible. And I feel like it's always important to play some sort of exercise that allows for just smoothness of phrase and continuity, especially as it pertains to color. Because, you know, if we're playing in different registers and the different registers have different colors or different dynamics and it's not quite balanced or consistent or cohesive, then it's hard to create cohesive musical phrases that just sort of simply speak for themselves. And little exercises like this, you can really go a long way in isolating that particular aspect of our playing. So with that in mind too, look, why don't we move to some vocalies? And these are my favorite thing ever. I started doing these about a year ago, and I am a complete convert. And I have a number of different examples of vocalies that we can do together. And this is the first one that Mr. Bernold lists in his book. And it's something that, like I mentioned, a lot of singers you've probably heard do it. Just to give you an example of the first one in C major. You know, going up in a tonic chord, coming down in the dominant, ending up on the tonic. Now, the reason I think that these are just so profound are, you know, there aren't a lot of exercises in my mind that emphasize music in motion, where you're creating a truly musical phrase, unless you bring that yourself to it. And this one is a very basic example of that. Some of the other vocalies we'll look at in a minute are actual musical examples transposed into different keys. But what I love about this is something that you might see in any piece you play ever, an ascending arpeggio and a descending arpeggio. And just making sure that we're, as flutists, we're comfortable playing an ascending and descending phrase in one breath with a consistent tone that's full and resonant and unforced. It's super important. And I feel like, you know, emphasizing this in our playing, it achieves a lot of different things all at once. So why don't we play through this? Why don't we start with this? So nice and slow. And what I'm thinking about in myself while as I do these is to take a deep breath and try to create the most centered tone on the first note as possible. And then, like I'm, you know, like a cooker, Bob Ross or something, just kind of take that tone and just move it through every single note. Just paint it across the plate, across the canvas, whatever. But whatever that first tone is, just have that be the foundation of the whole phrase, and just allow that sound to move through every note and to get out of my own way. No manipulation, no nonsense, no contortions with my embouchure or body or anything. Just whatever tone I make, just allow that to sing through the phrase. So let's start here. So 1, 2, and. Just take a pause there now that we've gone like halfway through the exercise. So for those of you that were playing along, looks easy, sounds easy, some deceptively tricky things about it. So what sort of things were you noticing as you played through this that were either successful or where you were like, oh, you know, this, if I was going to do it a second time through, I would slightly modify or change something? No, what sort of things did you notice? Oh yeah, I will say that for some of these and some of those less friendly keys, if you're looking at this for the first time, I mean, I definitely, you know, took several passes for me to get them under my fingers. But yeah, the breathing as well. I don't know if any of you heard, but there was a couple where I was definitely like at the end of the toothpaste tube, you know, in terms of my lung capacity, because, you know, to make a full resonant sound takes a lot of air, and you know, when you're on that last note to keep that same vibrancy, totally tricky. Yeah, excellent. Anything else? What else did some of you notice? This exercise forces you to take a breath where you expand, or you won't be able to really achieve the color that you want. So I mean, yeah, that's something that I think is excellent. For me, I think part of the part of the thing for me is I feel much more comfortable ascending than descending. I don't know if any of you feel that way. Sometimes as I ascend on the flute, I think of myself going up, and when I do that, the tone can at times become kind of sharp and less full. And sometimes when I'm going down, I think about myself going down, and the tone can become more constricted and maybe not speak the way I want it to. So sometimes when I do this exercise, I play a mind game where as I'm ascending, I imagine that I'm descending, which allows me to create more depth in my sound and to blow down and fill out the flute. And then as I'm going down the scale, I imagine myself becoming more elevated. And in that way, as I go down to those low notes, there's less of a danger of me squelching them or constricting the tone. So if you identify with that at all, that might be helpful. Can we go to the next vocalies, the next pattern? So this one's a modified version of the one that we just did, and it becomes slightly more difficult. I'm not sure why, but in this one he's much more friendly to us. Instead of listing the key signature at the beginning, he lists it on every note, which makes it much easier to read on a first pass. But the thing I love about this is it incorporates some of the elements of what we just did, but in the middle of the phrase, it adds this really large sort of interval, right? This minor seventh, which takes this idea of expansion. You go up the first arpeggio, just like that. It's much easier when you're doing it in thirds, but then he creates a similarly large interval, but without all of the filler notes in the middle of it. And what I love about this is, in the first bar, he shows you what you need to do in order to get from that low F to that high A, what you have to do with your air and your embouchure. And then in the third bar, he asks you to basically do the same thing without any of the notes in between, much faster. So whenever I do this exercise, I try to emulate whatever I'm doing in the first bar to achieve that the way I want it to be. And I just try to carry that over to what's happening in the third bar, just in that first beat of the third bar. So just so you hear it once, I'll do the first line once here before we do it together. Again, just going for as consistent a sound as possible, and then making sure that that seventh really opens up and sings. I like to use a little bit of vibrato, give it a little bit of color and sonority, but also just to make it as smooth and cohesive as possible. So I'll give 2 bars for nothing. Why don't we do this together? So 1, 2, ready? Next one. Let's do one more. And again, I mean, even more than the last one, I feel like my own lung capacity is being tested, you know, in order to see like how full can I play this without running out of air by the end, and seeing what that's like. Class as well. Yes. Can we go to the next page and do this? I think the next one is the example from Brahms, which I think is probably my favorite Vocalies in the whole book. Yeah. So for those of you who are familiar with Brahms' First Symphony, this is an appropriated oboe solo from the first movement. but it is just fabulous. So this incorporates some of the same ideas, even if you just look at the contour and not the specific notes. You start low, you do some stuff and you get higher, and you do some stuff and you get lower. But what this does is it really tests much more individual. On one hand, it touches more individual intervals. As you see, there's, thirds, fourths, fifths, octaves, and such. But also, it goes from piano to forte back to piano. I always like to think of the middle being forte, even though it isn't indicated. And for those of you who haven't heard this melody, it is just sumptuous. So I always try to play this with the most dark, colorful, contoured sound, much more activity than the other exercises. And I always like to use this as a color exercise in addition to a dynamic exercise. So let me just play the first phrase so you can kind of get that in your ear. Something like that. So still going for smoothness, but really I'm thinking about starting with just a still dark sound, and as it gets louder and we get these larger intervals, more vibrato, faster vibrato, culminating in the third bar where I really try to soar and sing, and then try to come down into a position of calmness as much as possible, and trying in this last little appoggiatura, those last two notes, to not go flat and make sure that you can really get that tension and release at the end, that sense that you're going towards the first beat and then allowing the tone to release in for the second. So why don't we do a few of these together, nice and slow. So 1, 2, 3, ready? I just love these. Not only is it just a melody that every time I sit next to an oboist and they do it, I want to play their instrument, but it also just provides so much in it, just in terms of color. And, sometimes, if I feel like doing this, and I like trying to test my ability to turn on a dime, sometimes I'll do a subito piano into the third bar, which even more tests it. So just to show you what that's like, in the last key that we did. And then allowing myself to go towards the end. And that really tests our ability to evaporate and melt into octaves, which, if it's done well, is just, it's just a heartbreaking moment in any piece. It's such a cool color. And so, I always try to be as creative and different with these, but this one in particular, I feel like it's just such a wonderful color exercise among everything else. So, we've talked a bit about connection and color and a centered tone in our bodies and intonation and all of that. And I've been talking a lot, but I would really love to hear what sort of exercises any of you have found that you find sustaining, that really get you oriented on the flute.
I really like the I've been playing a lot of piccolo, and so the Mazzanti method, I like the Vocalies is in that one a lot.
Mazzanti. Oh, I'm not
yeah.
familiar with those.
Nic-
Perfect.
Nicola Mazzanti. He has a big piccolo book. So
Okay.
I've been doing the Vocalies on that one a lot. And like number 5 and 6 are my favorite. But
Number 5 and 6.
very similar to what we were doing.
Wonderful. Yeah, I am totally gonna use those 5 and 6. I would love to hear from several other people if you're comfortable with it. What other things do you find yourselves doing? And if you say, "Hey, I do Taffanel Gobert number 4 at 160 on 16th notes," hey, I'd love to hear it. You know, good for you. But you know, yeah. Anyone? I have to say, from Taffanel and Gobert, my favorite one is I don't know if it's number 10 or number 12, but it's the arpeggiated one that's separated into major, minor, half diminished, and fully diminished arpeggios. Because I feel like it takes a lot of what we did in the Vocalies and does it in a faster frame of time. I think like starting on G, it's something like. And then you just kind of go down doing those patterns. It's been a while since I've done it, but that one's awesome. I love it.
But it's more about it gets the lips in the right position. Because if your lips are pulled back or if you're tight, weird, you can't create that hum and the tone. So that was what I was wanting to say at the very beginning. I can't see everybody, but still, that was what.
I love that you just said that. I think singing and playing is just amazing. So yeah, for anyone who doesn't do that, that's incredible. Something else, if we're talking about sort of more, not that that's necessarily an extended technique, but if we're talking about extended techniques as a warm up, if you ever feel that your air support isn't necessarily the way that you want it to be, doing even just the De La Sonorite pattern that Cindy just offered with a flutter tongue. It forces the air speed and support that you need, because if it's not active, then it won't produce. So if you went the air speed and connection to diaphragm will be engaged in a way too. So I feel like that works well. Fabulous. Well, thank you so much for having me. Everything that San Diego Flute Guild is doing to create this sense of community now, it's a joy, and I can't wait for the other offerings you have.
No, I hope everyone has a great weekend, and we'll see you at our next event. Bye, everyone.
Take care.